There is a fifth dimension, beyond that which is known to man. It lies between the pit of his fears and the summit of his knowledge, etc., etc. It's a place we call the Twilight Zone. You know, the Twilight Zone is one of my favorite TV shows of all time. Every year I look forward to it. I share episodes with my students when we talk about various literary concepts like flashback and characterization. And it's a show that I've been watching since I was a little boy, and it's really shaped me as a human being. And one reason I love the Twilight Zone so much is that it's an anthology. Every story is completely different. And that got me thinking for this Halloween, what about anthology horror movies? The Twilight Zone has one, released in the early 80s. Feature-length film, but contains several distinct stories with little to no overlap. What are some of the other examples of classic horror anthologies? There are a lot out there for sure. So I thought today let's look at some of those earlier ones, some of the ones that helped to sort of shape the genre, and if this video is successful, we'll go back and revisit some others as well, because there's quite a bit to cover. So let's buckle in and take a look at the Anthology Zone. Probably the best place to start with anything is the beginning. From 1919, Eerie Tales. Eerie Tales is often cited as the first feature-length horror anthology, and as far as I know, that's exactly what it is. Eerie Tales was made in Germany, featuring Conrad Veidt, today probably best remembered as Major Strasser in Casablanca, but he had a very long career in horror films and similar ones, such as one of the most famous of all German horror films, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Now we're not really going to talk about Caligari today because that's not an anthology film, of course, but we are going to talk about a movie it's related to here in a bit. But let's begin with Conrad Veidt in Eerie Tales. Now Conrad Veidt doesn't have to do the whole thing himself, of course. He's teamed up with Reinhold Schunzel. You can see him there on the side of the box there, begging and pleading. And as a female lead, we have Anita Berber. And I say this because all of these actors appear in each of the 5 stories. So something that even this early on, over 100 years ago, shortly after the end of World War I, already we have some of the regular tropes we associate with anthology films right off the bat. One being reusing the same cast member or members for each story in the anthology. This would be a device that was used in several others. Here's an Edgar Allan Poe one from the 60s where each story features Vincent Price in the lead. Or you might think of Trilogy of Terror with Karen Black playing the lead in each of the 3 stories there. So there's one thing that it has. Another thing it has is a framing device, a large story into which all of the smaller stories fit. Now not every horror anthology film has that. A good example, and one we've talked about on this channel before, is Quaidon. Quaidon is just, here's story 1, here's story 2, here's story 3. There's nothing to connect these stories in any way. So it's an odd choice, and probably I would say in the minority. Most of them, including one we'll get to later in this video, have some kind of device where characters might be reading these stories, or telling each other these stories, and even this early on, again, over 100 years ago, that already pops up with Eerie Tales. In this case, Death, who is played by Conrad Veidt, Satan, played by Reinhold Schunzel, and a harlot, played by Anita Berber, scare a bookstore owner out of his bookstore with elementary level annoyance tactics, and then proceed to read from the various horror books that he has and tell each other these stories. It's a very simple framing device, and not really that much is made of it, but it does serve to link each story together. The back of the box, this is from Alpha Video, so don't expect anything too fancy, but the back of the box lists each of the stories. It starts off with something that actually we talked about last year when I did my Best of Hitchcock. It starts off with a version of Into Thin Air, also known as The Vanishing Lady. Alfred Hitchcock would redo this famous story as an espionage thriller in his 1938 movie The Lady Vanishes. He would also direct a more straightforward adaptation in the first season of Alfred Hitchcock Presents, which I believe keeps the original title Into Thin Air. But here it's done a direct, straight adaptation, a man trying to help his wife, trying to help a wife, I should say, escape her abusive ex-husband who's stalking her, offers this young lady check her into a hotel and she'll be safe there away from him, but then comes back later to find that she's gone and the hotel room is completely different and everybody's telling him he's crazy, but he knows he's not really crazy, he remembers all this stuff. Conrad Veidt is perfect in that lead role as that man trying to be a good Samaritan, trying to help out, and driven mad by the fact everyone keeps telling him he's wrong all the time. I will say, although it's a pretty good story, probably the best of these five actually, especially in terms of its quality and its execution, it's really let down by the ending where another character just tells him the twist, and it ends with a very bizarre and honestly pretty funny shot of Veidt falling into a bush, which is never really explained. So that's kind of a disappointing ending, but the rest of the story is quite good. That idea would also be adapted into movies like So Long at the Fair. So a good way to start off the anthology. Then we have The Hand, where Schunzel and Veidt have a dice game to win the hand of Berber in marriage. And even though Veidt wins, Schunzel's such a sore loser he kills him, and then is haunted by the ghost. And if there's one thing you could say about Conrad Veidt, he's a good actor to choose for a vengeful ghost, and indeed his, stalking of Schunzel throughout the film. We see his hand quite a bit, but nothing else. Works really well, and it ends, of course, with the seance that goes absolutely crazy. We have an adaptation of an Edgar Allan Poe classic, The Black Cat. Hollywood was not especially kind to Edgar Allan Poe, at least in those first kind of formative years, the early sound era. Think of movies like 1934's The Black Cat, or Maniac, or The Raven. Those things are pseudo-Poe adaptations, but aren't really direct Poe adaptations. But this version of The Black Cat, again, made in Germany around 1919, is pretty faithful. Schunzel is this drunken wife-beater who goes crazy and kills his wife. Veidt is the man investigating this murder and gradually realizing what has become of the missing woman. The cover art for this DVD is taken from the finale to this. The problem I have with it is that Schunzel here overacts ridiculously during the big finale, while Veidt here underacts, and they're kind of working against each other. Doesn't quite come off at the end. But it's nice to see a pretty faithful adaptation of The Black Cat. They even change up the ending so that the clue, giving away the cat's location, because he's not where he's supposed to be, is actually done so it's a visual cue, as this is a silent film and not an auditory one. So I really like that. I'm glad that was done there. We have a Robert Louis Stevenson adaptation of The Suicide Club. Schunzel wants to join this club, but every so often the current members have to take a card from a deck, and if it's the Ace of Spades, they have to kill themselves. And so he finds himself, indeed, drawing the Ace of Spades and trying to figure a way out of that. I've never read the Robert Louis Stevenson originals, so I'm not sure how faithful they are, but it's definitely a good macabre story. It's, again, Schunzel overacts quite a bit, but this one I think it feels a little more natural. And finally, an original tale from director Richard Oswald. Indeed, he's actually seen in kind of like a pre-credits scene, horsing around with Schunzel and Veidt, is the spook or the ghost or the apparition. It's known by multiple titles. Alpha Video even stated they rewrote all the title cards for this, so it's probably not what audiences would have seen back in the day. But this last one, set in the sort of powdered wig era, involves a duel, or I shouldn't say a duel really, but more of a little bit of a tryst between Schunzel, who's a knight recuperating from an injury, and Veidt, who's a neglectful husband, over the hand of Berber. It's not a great story. There are some very primitive kind of ghost effects. Supposedly the castle's haunted, but it mostly involves picture frames moving up and down, and it's not very impressive. The real highlight, though, is Berber actually gets a chance to do something. She plays a supporting role in each of the other stories. She gets kind of a chance to actually be a big part of the action in the final one. Eerie Tales is very basic. It's very primitive, but as the very first of its kind, it's surprising how much it gets right. And yeah, parts are a little tedious. Again, Reinhold Schunzel goes ham way too often, but Conrad Veidt is quite good, and I like that we see a lot of those tropes that we would come to associate with the horror anthology genre popping up even this early on. It's no Cabinet of Caligari or anything like that, but at the end of the day, it's worth seeing, I think, if you're a fan of horror anthologies. A good place for the genre to begin. Let's stay in Germany, but fast forward a few years. Here's a really nice box set from Kino. This is an old box set now, but some of those epic German horror classics, Nosferatu, of course, still beloved today, The Golem, and Dr. Caligari, very, very important. But let's talk Waxworks. Now, Waxworks is interesting in the sense that although it's heavily marketed as a horror anthology, I wouldn't really say that it was. A young writer, played by director William Deturle, he would later become very prominent in America. We talked about some of his films in previous videos, like The Life of Emile Zola and All That Money Can Buy, also known as The Devil and Daniel Webster. But here he plays a young poet asked to write little stories about each of the figures in a wax museum, that kind of thing. And so, even though there are 4 figures featured, I don't know how you can see them, only 3 actually get any focus. There's the Caliph of Baghdad, Jack the Ripper, or Spring-Heeled Jack, we'll talk about that in a little bit, and of course Ivan the Terrible, played by none other than Conrad Veidt. Those are his eyeballs on the front of the package there. The problem with Waxworks is it's all over the place. The first story is about the Caliph of Baghdad, and so our young poet sits down and writes a story about where he's a young baker living in ancient Baghdad in love with this girl, and then when the Sultan orders him to be killed, or the Caliph I should say, not the Sultan, but it certainly reminded me so much of Aladdin, that's all I could think of while I watched it. But when the Caliph orders him killed due to his smoky bakery, the Vizier, who is not named Jafar, but probably could have been, doesn't kill her, and instead points her out to the Caliph as a potential wife, and this leads to a big conflict of interest, and it ends with the Aladdin-ish baker character trying to steal the Caliph's magical ring. It's very much a fantasy, no horror elements really, but at the end of the day, first of all, at over 40 minutes, it's the longest segment here, and it's definitely the one it feels like they put the most time and effort into. But more importantly, it doesn't really go much of anywhere. I like that they build what look like real-life Flintstone houses for these ancient citizens to live in. And I like that we get Emil Jannings to play the Caliph. He is most famous for winning the first Best Actor Oscar, his role in The Last Command, a very good film. Not horror or fantasy or anything like that. But this first segment goes on way too long, and it doesn't live up to a movie that's marketed as a horror film. The second segment, featuring Conrad Veidt as Ivan the Terrible, is much better, and Veidt plays him with just complete insanity. And indeed, to avoid an assassination attempt, he switches clothes, I should say, with a nobleman, and then an assassination attempt kills the nobleman, but spares Ivan the Terrible. Then he promptly storms the wedding of the man's daughter and demands her, and it's really, really twisted and weird, and Conrad Veidt is perfectly cast as Ivan the Terrible, who's gradually driven more and more insane with time. And soon, when he realizes that his life may be nearing its end, he goes absolutely berserk. This is the reason I think most people remember Waxworks, because the Caliph story isn't really substantial enough, I think, for someone to sink their teeth into. And I would say this is worth watching just for that segment alone. It's very atmospheric, very moody. Again, they experiment with a lot of color tinting. Blue when they're outside, gold when they're inside, red when they're in Ivan the Terrible's torture dungeon, that kind of thing. But really interesting stuff. And Veidt absolutely sells it. Deturle, of course, plays a dual role too. He gets, or I should say a triple role. He gets a chance to interact with Ivan the Terrible as the prospective groom of this wedding where the bride is promptly stolen. Interesting stuff, but then we have this really weird ending segment that's less than 10 minutes long, featuring Werner Krauss as Jack the Ripper or Spring-Heeled Jack. Now the title cards in most, if not all, versions call him Spring-Heeled Jack, but the plaque underneath the wax figure clearly says Jack the Ripper. The movie buys into Spring-Heeled Jack, I don't know. But instead of being like a story segment where we are transported through time or space, we get Jack the Ripper figure comes to life and kind of sort of stalks them through the amusement park area where this wax museum is set up. And I like Werner Krauss's performance. He doesn't really emote, he keeps his face very blank except his eyes which blink and move, and that kind of works for a wax figure come to life, but it feels like an afterthought, and I was pretty disappointed in it, to be, perfectly honest. You can see he's on the back of the DVD case there. He looks the part, but they don't really give him enough to do, and they didn't really seem to write much of a story, more of just this weird sort of, time filler sequence. There is a fourth wax figure too, Reinhold, who does nothing. Presumably they want to do something with him and didn't. I will say the wax figures themselves are quite convincing. I can't tell if they were dummies or the actors were maybe put into some kind of frame so they could hold very still. Reminded me a lot of one of my favorite hour-long Twilight Zone episodes, The New Exhibit with Martin Balsam. And it kind of felt almost like a precursor to that in some ways, but with the horror elements dialed back. So if you're looking for a horror film, Waxworks is probably the wrong place. But if you want to see Conrad Veidt go crazy as Ivan the Terrible, then I think you'll have a good time with this. But I was, honestly, kind of disappointed. And so, as we're not doing entirely silent films today, let's do one more. We'll cover a classic, 1945's Dead of Night. I would say this is probably one of those horror anthologies that everybody should see, because there's something here for everyone. Horror movies, in terms of their production and distribution, were banned in England during much, if not all, of World War II. Probably because being incessantly bombed by Hitler's planes was much scarier than anything a horror movie could show you. So Dead of Night, one of the few horror movies from this period at all, from England, is a really fascinating watch. Now, first of all, it goes really hard with its framing story. A man who's driving out to see this country mansion feels like he's done this all before in a dream. And indeed, it's all a dream thing, which is usually an excuse to cop out of a good ending, or to avoid having to explain why something's plausible, is actually used to great horror effect here, as he realizes this nightmare he's been having about this particular place might be coming true around him. Dead of Night also tells 5 stories, the first of which is The Bus Conductor, which was adapted into the Twilight Zone episode 22. You have a dream or a vision where some creepy-looking figure is beckoning you somewhere. You know you shouldn't go. So when you see that figure in real life, you stay away from them and you live. That kind of thing. I like the Twilight Zone version better. This one's pretty simple, but it does serve. Then there's another story about a girl at a children's kind of like birthday, Christmas party, and sees a little boy crying and realizes he's not one of the guests, but actually the ghost of a murdered child. Again, it's pretty light, pretty simple. They didn't do a lot with it to kind of embellish it, but it's serviceable and serves to kind of build as the movie goes. We don't want the best story right away. We have a story about a possessed mirror. A woman buys it for her husband, and they find that the mirror has a rather sordid history involving murder and might be willing to sort of curse the couple. Very interesting idea there. The Twilight Zone tinkered with something similar in its episode The Mirror, featuring Columbo himself, Peter Falk, as Fidel Castro, which is worth seeing. But it isn't quite the same story. That mirror could kind of predict the future, supposedly. This one is trying to relive its past and see if it can drive this man and woman to murder-suicide as it did its previous owners. Pretty effective stuff. And then we have the most controversial, or at least the most discussed segment in terms of maybe confusion, and that's a comedy ghost story. 2 men wager their marriage to a young girl. She can't pick between them, so they decide to play a hand of golf and wager who gets to marry her on the winner. One man cheats, the other drowns himself in the lake at the golf course, but he finds he's doomed to wander the earth and he can't manage to make his ethereal ghost self disappear. It's completely played for laughs, and indeed features Basil Radford and Naughton Wayne, who had been previously teamed in The Lady Vanishes, and would be teamed in several other movies as kind of a goofy comedy team, these quintessential British gentlemen who get up to all these wacky shenanigans. Some people don't like it, feeling that it messes with the tone of the film. It's a fun story, and a little risque too, I might add, especially for the time. But at the end of the day, it does kind of run against the other stories, which are all kind of straightforward horror ones. I don't know, it's very odd. I think it's based on an H.G. Wells story, but if it is, it's one of the few I haven't read. So, I don't know. Something a little bit different. And then we come to the most famous segment of the whole thing, evil ventriloquist dummy. Michael Redgrave as the ventriloquist who is convinced his dummy, Hugo, is alive. And we see several of these tropes repeated in the Twilight Zone, notably in the episode The Dummy, the ventriloquist dummy biting its owner, that kind of thing. And there's a very effective scene in Dead of Night of the dummy coming to life, where it's played by a midget actor. And it's very good. It's probably one of the scariest moments in all of 1940s cinema. And that leads to a big finale where the framing story also draws to a climax and a close, that kind of thing too. So it's interesting that unlike, say, Eerie Tales, where the framing story is very basic, just enough to kind of link these things all together, here, this one actually has, a denouement, it has a plot. Very interesting stuff. And I think that will do us for a little trilogy of terror today. So, Eerie Tales, Waxworks, of course, I'll hold up that box set again, and the 1940s classic Dead of Night. There are many, many, many horror anthology films to discuss, and I hope I get a chance to talk about more of them with you. Please comment some of your favorites below, and we'll see you next time. Watch out for those ventriloquist dummies now.